This must be Pearl, the record keeper.
Hey there, Blade fans! Today we're talking about the anatomy of Pearl the Vampire. Let's get into it. How many of you have seen Stephen Norrington's Blade? The reason I'm asking you is because stealing the spotlight of today's video is Pearl, the severely obese vampire who, despite having about 2.5 minutes of screen time in the entire movie, ended up becoming one of the most iconic and unforgettable characters in the 1998 film. Truth be told, Pearl appears exactly in one scene, but that does the trick for the character, and I think it's safe to admit that this vampire here is the most physically unsettling character in the whole Blade franchise. In fact, the anatomical and physiological questions that this body raises are quite remarkable, and there's a lot more to Pearl than you think you know. So join me in today's video where I'll be breaking down the anatomy of Pearl for you. Are you ready? Let's dive right into the video then.
What is that?
That biscuit boy is a UV lamp.
Who is Pearl? I don't know about you, but when I caught the first glimpse of Pearl, I thought the character was female, given the appearance. And dare I disregard that distinctly squeaky, raspy voice? Of course, I was wrong. What we're looking at happens to be a male, morbidly obese vampire, one who's just physically incapable of moving on his own. In the movie, Pearl is a researcher and record keeper of the House of Erebus. He's highly intelligent and well-read, given that he possesses the ability to not only read, but also translate the lost pages of Erebus. In fact, Pearl was actually helping Deacon Frost decode the prophecy of the blood god, La Magra, and telling him about the ritual that would require the sacrifice of 12 pure-blood vampires. No wonder Pearl was extremely valuable to Frost, and all the more so because Frost knew Pearl was irreplaceable as a research tool. But hey, make no mistake in thinking that Frost kept him alive out of loyalty. You see, at the end of the day, Pearl was just an informant, and Frost was using him for information. The minute Pearl was located by Blade and Karen in his underground lair, Frost viewed him as expendable, and he simply refused to save him. Why is Pearl so obese, and is it physically possible for a vampire? Well, there's no denying that we're looking at a vampire here, one who is so fat that he just cannot move. But this is also one of the questions that fans of the movie have been asking for the longest time, and I can assure you all that you'll be getting some answers in this video. The most basic thing about vampires is that they need to drink blood to survive. So is it just blood that caused Pearl to be immovably obese? I'm happy to say that the answer is provided by none other than Stephen Norrington himself. The Blade filmmaker leaks some rather intriguing little information that states Pearl's massive size was caused by his insatiable, monstrous appetite for children, especially infants whose hearts he absolutely loved to relish. Please keep in mind that Pearl's particular eating habit is not classified as casual feeding. Rather, it was an obsessive, repetitive behavioral trait that persisted for a very long time. In fact, early script drafts of David S. Goyer actually featured more graphic representations of Pearl's lifestyle, showing the bodies and hearts of children strewn across his archive to put more emphasis on Pearl's gruesome nature and insatiable gluttony. This subplot was eventually dropped during production because Norrington didn't want the horror to become too dark and repulsive to his viewers. I'd also like to point out another interesting observation here. Vampires in the Blade universe are known as homines nocturnae, which means vampirism is a lot more than just a supernatural curse. It's a biological condition brought on by a mutagenic virus that simply changes the host's body. The point I'm trying to make here is that if a vampire kept on consuming excess amounts of solid organ tissue for, let's say, centuries, then it would end up looking exactly like Pearl, a body that just kept taking in and had no biological mechanism to offload it. How old is Pearl, and how long has his body been doing this? While it's true that the movie doesn't really mention anything about Pearl's age as such, it's quite evident that he's an ancient vampire. In the Blade universe, the House of Erebus functions as the main governing body of the vampires, and there's no denying that the members of Erebus consist of pure-blood vampires who have been around for thousands of years. Now, keeping in mind that the Book of Erebus has records and archives covering centuries of vampire history, and adding to this Pearl's role as its archivist, it does signify that he's been in this position for a very long time indeed. As for the part of how long Pearl's physiology has been like this, I've already stated before that his condition isn't the consequence of a few decades of bad habits. Pearl's enormous size, his inability to move, and his complete reliance on his surroundings all point to a body that's been losing its physical capacity over centuries due to the acclimated input. Of course, the time frame is important here because if I'm being honest, a normal human body under identical circumstances would have died from complications in a matter of years. I think it's fitting to acknowledge that it's Pearl's undead biology that has kept him alive, which is also pretty much the main problem here. What has centuries underground done to his skin? If you've seen the movie, you'll agree with me when I say every other vampire in this film is visibly distinct from Pearl, and of course there are reasons for this. While the majority of the vampires in the Blade universe have relatively normal-looking skin, Pearl is pale and covered in bubbling pustules and severe blisters. In fact, I don't think I'm wrong to say that Pearl's skin appears as though he's been inside an enclosed space for centuries, intentionally depriving himself of sunlight and any form of physical activity. Pearl, in my opinion, is a sheer example of what happens when a vampire continues to have an unchecked intake of solid organ tissue instead of blood, which is also what has led to his immense physical expansion, restricting him to bed. A closer look at the pustules and you'll find a couple of reasons for this. To begin with, there's this constant lingering pressure brought on by continuous immobility that has caused Pearl's skin to deteriorate, particularly at the areas of contact. Next, it's also way too stressful to keep tissue integrity intact across a surface area that was never meant to be this huge in the first place. If you can think of more reasons, please do feel free to share them with me in the comments section. Does Pearl still possess vampire powers despite his size? First things first, Pearl is a vampire and one simply can't disregard that. So this obviously means that he possesses all the conventional powers of a vampire, like having phenomenal strength, enhanced senses, quick healing, and the usual resistance to wounds. But having said that, Pearl unfortunately cannot use most of his powers. You see, despite being a supernatural predator, he cannot run, fight, and pursue his prey or even escape from danger. Pearl's gargantuan size prohibits him from doing anything for that matter. Now, if you can recall the flick, try to remember his introductory scene. Even with Blade and Karen torturing Pearl with the UV lamp in order to lay their hands on more information, Pearl's only response was letting out a blood-curdling scream. Okay, let's be honest here. Physically, Pearl just didn't have any other options, and it's quite ironic to find a vampire trapped inside a body so completely debilitated by its own consumption that it's unable to carry out even a single predatory function. What does his UV vulnerability tell us about his biology? Well, if you're someone who's well-versed with the Blade universe, you will know that the vampires here are gravely sensitive to ultraviolet radiation, and there are no two ways about it. In fact, there have been plenty of instances where UV exposure has resulted in rapid, severe skin damage. Speaking of UV, when Karen uses a UV lamp on him, his skin starts to burn immediately. Needless to say, the damage is instant and extreme, as Pearl is seen absolutely writhing in pain. While it's never made clear if Pearl dies at the end of the movie, the UV lamp torture leaves him severely burned and deformed. Also, one thing is for certain, Pearl's UV sensitivity is way too high compared to that of other vampires, and since he's been living underground with no exposure to the sun for centuries, his skin never had an opportunity to develop even the slightest bit of resistance. Is Pearl's body the natural final form of a powerful vampire? It was Daniel Kibblesmith and Federico Sabatini's Darkhold Blade Issue 1 where fans got to witness what I believe has been the most important lore expansion when it comes to Pearl's physiology. This comic depicts a warped universe in which Blade was unable to prevent Deacon Frost from reading the Darkhold, resulting in the devastating V-Wave. But rather than depicting the traditional Dracula-like vampires, the story reveals that the ultimate biological conclusion of vampiric power and comfort may be morbid immobility and complete reliance on subordinates. Therefore, there's a high possibility that Pearl's size can be the final stage of powerful vampires who overfeed, rather than some kind of hideous aberration. Well, now that I see things this way, I can't really dismiss the theory that the strongest vampires, and in this case the ones with the easiest and greatest access to feeding, and the least amount of physical hunting, will eventually reach a point where unrestricted intake equals zero physical expenditure. Well, technically this is exactly what Pearl stands for. How does he feed, and what does that mean for vampire metabolism? Now, I've already mentioned this before, Pearl can't move. This is also the reason why he can't hunt. Well then, this leads me and every other fan to one basic question. How does he feed? In the movie, Pearl is seen working for Frost and permanently housed in an underground archive room. So while it has not been explicitly shown in the film, it's a given thing that it's the job of Frost's familiars to bring food and victims directly to Pearl. Add to this Pearl's fixation when it comes to devouring the hearts of infants. This just shows that Pearl's eating habits were never strictly vampiric in the traditional sense. He was, after all, obsessively eating whole body parts for centuries. What happens to his body when he dies? And what does Pearl tell us about vampire biology that no other character does? The 1998 movie most definitely established UV light as a lethal weapon against vampires. As for Pearl, he's seen getting subjected to extreme burns and blisters all over his body on being exposed to full intensity UV radiation. I don't think it would be wrong to state that he literally looked like a roasted marshmallow. With that being said, it's Pearl's enormous size that makes things certainly all the more interesting. While most vampires in the Blade universe are seen almost immediately succumbing to UV radiation, addition, Pearl's entire body is so humongous that the destruction cannot be an instant process. What's even more absurd is that it's Pearl's expansive body that prolongs his death, causing him great suffering. In fact, Pearl is the only vampire in the Blade universe who exemplifies what happens when vampiric biology is allowed to run amok with unrestricted feeding and no physical constraint, whereas every other vampire in the franchise is sculpted by the basic need to survive. Well, I hate to admit that I'm pretty much toward the end of the video, and I think it's safe to say that the endpoint of unchecked vampiric consumption is always going to be Pearl. That being said, he isn't the worst vampire in the franchise, but when it comes to his introduction in the film, it's categorically one of the most disturbing introductions that I've seen for sure. Anyway, this is all that I have for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Pearl. Have you seen Stephen Norrington's Blade? What did you think of Pearl? Tell me everything in the comments section. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more such videos. As for me, I promise to come back with another favorite video soon. Thanks for watching and have a good one.